Registering as an independent and showing up to work with the title of independent is a reflection of who I've always been. And it's a reflection of who Arizona is. It's a reflection of the folks that I talk to at the grocery store, hear from at the park. It's who we are as a people. We don't line up to do what we're told. We do what's right for our state and for our country.
That was Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema and her recent announcement that she's leaving the Democratic Party and becoming an independent. In an op-ed for a local Arizona outlet, AZ Central, Sinema wrote, "My approach is rare in Washington and has upset partisans in both parties. It is also an approach that has delivered lasting results for Arizona. Like a lot of Arizonans, I have never fit perfectly in either national party. Becoming an independent won't change my work in the Senate. My service to Arizona remains the same."
The decision has faced mixed reviews, including from our panelists, who both reacted to it in Newsweek. Jason Nichols, senior lecturer of African American Studies at the University of Maryland, wrote, quote, "Kyrsten Sinema tells the Democratic Party to go to hell." And Brad Polumbo, opinion journalist and co-founder of Based Politics, wrote, quote, "Bravo, Kyrsten Sinema, you represent millions of Americans who hate both parties." Welcome to you both, Jason and Brad.
Hey, good morning.
Thank you for having us.
Jason, I'll start with you. What's your beef with Kyrsten Sinema over this flip, which I think for all intents and purposes is a branding exercise or a political exercise designed for her to avoid a primary challenge? I'm not sure she's actually going to shift her substantive policies at all. But what do you make of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly it. Now, look, I understand what Brad is saying. I'm somebody who has been voting since 1996. You can see the grays in my beard, and I became a Democrat really in 2017 after seeing what happened with Senator Sanders, who I supported, and after seeing that, I wanted to be able to vote in primaries, so I registered as a Democrat. So I'm a pretty new Democrat in many ways, even though my ideas haven't changed. So I understand what Brad is saying about people who don't necessarily align completely with either party, but that's not what this is. This is Kyrsten Sinema making a power play. She understood what was going on. She understood that she was at about 19% favorability amongst Democratic voters. She understood that she had a primary challenger who won his race and got 77% of the vote in his congressional district and was at 74% approval amongst Arizona Democrats. She realized that the way she was going to win was to basically hold the party hostage and say, I'll take that 19% with me and run as an independent. And if you run a Democrat against me, we will see Senator Kari Lake. And she realizes that Democrats can't afford that. The other thing she recognizes is that she'll also take a lot of money with her because she votes, even though she was a former member of the Green Party, she votes to end $15 minimum wage or to not allow for a $15 minimum wage, and also to maintain the carried interest loophole so wealthy hedge fund managers don't have to pay taxes. So I think that this was a power play. We understand the motivation for it. I think it was a smart play, but let's not pretend this is about Arizona. This is Washington insider politics. This is how this kind of thing goes.
Well, Brad, you make the accurate point that a lot of Americans feel disaffected and like both parties aren't satisfying their needs. But part of why they feel that way is because the party doesn't reflect the interests of the folks. Overwhelmingly, people support a $15 minimum wage, including in red states like Florida, which famously voted 60% for a $15 minimum wage, even as it voted for Donald Trump, and on and on and on. So why should we understand what Kyrsten Sinema is doing here as anything other than a branding exercise?
Well, look, let's just be clear about the fact that she's a pretty reliable center-left voter. According to 538, she voted with Biden about 93% of the time. Senator Bernie Sanders voted with him about 91% of the time. There's not actually a ton of daylight between their voting records, though, yes, you're right about a few key issues like a $15 minimum wage. She has gone against her party. But what I say is I actually think Jason's right. She is telling the Democrats to go to hell, but that's what she should say to them. The Democratic Party has treated her worse than I have seen anyone treated in my recent memory in politics, and that's quite saying something. Pro-Biden, pro-Build Back Better activists illegally harassed her in the bathroom, recording, including a male activist following her into the women's room. And they've harassed her on airplanes. They've written so many horrible things about her. The vitriol directed at this woman for just the tiniest bit of dissent, 7% off from voting with Biden in lockstep, to me is just unhinged. So if the Democrats are getting, she's thumbing her nose at them to be sure, but I just think it's no less than they deserve for how they've treated her, and good for her. You know, there are more Arizona voters who are unaffiliated than there are Democrats or Republicans. Of course, she's a politician. Some of this is about her own interests in politics. I'm not naive. But it's also, I don't see any downside to it. The Democrats have treated her terribly. They're viewed very unfavorably as a party and as an institution. Why shouldn't she go independent?
Brad, I have no interest in defending whatever incidents happen in bathrooms and things like that, but I do think it speaks volumes to a lot of working people who are listening to have so much emphasis put on her personal grievances as an individual and have these really catastrophic cuts to people's benefits kind of brushed under the rug. Voting against the aspects of Build Back Better that were widely popular, like the child tax credit and the things that weren't able to pass in the human infrastructure bill. Voting down, not just saying, I'm not going to support this $15 minimum wage, but kind of mockingly doing that thumbs down gesture that went around the world. That has a direct impact on a lot of people's lives. We're living in the longest period in American history without a minimum wage raise in the middle of an economic crisis where a lot of working people are struggling. Do you think that they should prioritize that as they look to whether or not Kyrsten Sinema is actually going to support their independent interests as working people?
Sure, they should evaluate her policy positions, but I'll just say on all the issues you mentioned, and we don't have to get dragged down a rabbit hole, there are good faith arguments to be made on both sides. You and I have talked about the minimum wage, I believe. And it's not something that's just black and white. The good people all support one thing and the bad people all support other things. She could earnestly believe, like I do and like Robbie does and many others, that a $15 minimum wage would do more harm than good. And that doesn't make her an evil person. It's not just because of her corporate donors. There are donors on every side of the issue. Her voting record is not that different from Bernie Sanders, so I don't think any of us would call a corporate shill.
No, Brad, her voting record, those percentages are very misleading. And there are ways that we absolutely should not vote along with the Democratic Party, including to fund endless wars and these incredible defense budgets like the one we just passed and the Iron Dome and a lot of things. So simply looking at the numbers and saying 91%, 93%, that's the kind of sophistry that people use when they don't want to talk about people's specific records. Or to your first point, Brad, you argue that she is better able to represent the interest of most Americans as most Americans identify as independents. And I think that's true. But you have to look at why most Americans identify as independents. And you can't say, look at this plurality of people who want something different on one hand, and then poo-poo away the plurality of people who have articulated very firmly that whatever you and I think, they want a living wage. But I'm going to turn this back to you, Jason, because we haven't had you given you an opportunity to respond to much of this.
Yeah, I think one of the things, of course, there's the $15 minimum wage, but I'll bring it back to the carried interest loophole. There's literally no argument for keeping that. Republicans and Democrats are against the carried interest loophole, and there are many things that we can fund, including things like universal pre-K and other things that would come from closing that loophole, which would produce about $14 billion. And we know why she kept that loophole open and why she demanded it come out of that piece of legislation. Because of the fact that the investment industry gave her $2 million since 2018. So I think when we take her for who she is, she's a Washington insider. All those images of the beautiful countryside of Arizona, that's all kind of beside the point. The fact that she's playing hardball with the Democratic Party, and it's pure politics. And so and I would agree with Bree 100% that those voting records are when you just go by these clear percentages are very misleading. When you're holding up major legislation and getting important parts cut out, so then you vote for it and say, hey, yes, I voted with President Biden, I think isn't necessarily accurate. But I understand, again, Brad's underlying point about people being disaffected with both parties. I totally understand, and I think that is true. But I just think making Kyrsten Sinema some sort of representative of people who are disaffected with both parties, I think is incorrect.
We have to leave it there. Jason and Brad, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. Lots of-
We'll have more Rising right after this.